This is Making the Cut with BCC AVX, which means Avid, and my name is Grain Jones. I should mention just quickly, a lot of us are probably pretty excited about the new Adobe 2015 release that just came out, and I do want to mention that BCC 9 is compatible with Adobe's 2015 release, but do make sure to get the latest update from the Boris website. Speaking about Boris, I've been using Boris for about 15 years, around about the same amount of time I've been using Avid. BCC 9 has been around for about a year, but users still have a lot of questions about it. A lot of us might be kind of like me, where you've been using Symphony for a while and you're using the bundled Boris version, and the BCC 9 is an upgrade that you might want to be thinking about. And so we'll look at some of the reasons why. Today we're primarily focusing on transitions. 24 transitions are brand new to BCC 9. We'll also be covering how to use the effects browser and on-screen controls to speed up your editing, as well as some other time-saving techniques and a few advanced tips for layering effects. I want to say a special thanks to Weymouth Design for providing the footage for this webinar, and also to Avid for sponsoring the great prizes. And so let's maybe throw a transition on, just a random one on this sequence, just to get the discussion started. One of the biggest things that BCC 9 has brought in is these on-screen controls, which are really, really handy. If you look at the Composer window here, you see a bunch of graphs and points that I can manipulate, and these are some of the sort of most frequently accessed parameters. Boris kind of looked through and said, which things do we need immediate access to? Let me put them in the handiest place. Let's look over in the effect editor. You can of course open that up with the button on your timeline. I urge you to give it a keyboard shortcut, because you'll use it quite a bit and get to know that shortcut. But if you open up the animation tuning and manipulate the sliders, look over at the Composer window and you can see kind of what's happening. The blur ease in and ease out at the start and end affect the ramping of the blur, and then you've got a midpoint. If you think about it like a basketball's air time, if you look at that graph, you see, do you want the blur to kind of come up quickly and stay up and then go down, or do you want it to spike in the middle? And then you've got a dissolve that's happening underneath this effect, and you can affect the duration. Well, you see that dragging these controls on the screen is much more intuitive. And the nice thing about having this graph is, if you're a visual person like me, a lot of us editors are, this gives a very visual representation of what's happening. And you can get to the point where you actually kind of recognize the way these graphs look when you first open an effect, and you can see really, really quickly if you need to make any tweaks to the effect. I know that I like a really spiky middle, and I like a pretty short duration underneath. That's often the way I end up using my effects. I actually don't necessarily shorten the duration of the effect. I just play with the ramp so that I get a really nice organic pow, sort of organic way in and out. I'm not actually going to use this particular one, but I just wanted to illustrate the on-screen controls. And I should mention, with this heads-up display, HUD as it's called, if you don't see it, have a look in the effect editor, sort of in the top right area, and you might have the widgets off. Make sure to select the top one, which is standard UI widgets, and that pulls them on. If you're using Adobe Premiere, when you first apply the effect, you may have to do this as well. In Avid, they're automatically by default applied, but for some reason it might be saved without this applied, and you might have to engage that. This is also the place that you, if I just zoom out, where you can access things like your scale and crop, to do a really, really organic cropping of the image. I love using that way. One thing that I would mention is, when you crop using the on-screen controls, that applies keyframes to the cropping, which is not necessarily what you might want. But back to the on-screen controls. Let's delete this effect here, and let's look at what transition we might want to apply to the sequence. This is a bunch of basketball footage, but specifically it's it's footage that is slow motion right at that magical point where you don't know if that ball's going to go in the hoop or not, and then wow, it's in. And a bunch of sort of repetitions of that moment. And so I love using transitions that are organic to the sequence. I don't like putting just random transitions. I call that gorping it up. I don't like gorping it up. I want to really use something that that enhances the footage. And even more than that point, I also am thinking this footage is a little bit desaturated because it's an overcast day, and so I'm going to want to color this up a little bit as well. And lastly, I'm going to want to direct the eye towards the hoop. So how do we do all those things? One of the transitions I love in BCC 9 is the BCC Raise Dissolve. When I first apply it, it blows out the image, and so I'm going to want to dial that back a little bit. And of course, on the on-screen controls, I've got intensity. I can cut back on the intensity and maybe cut back on the ray length as well. And that gives a transition that still has the dissolving rays, but I can see it a little bit better. And I do want to color that out because I don't want it to blow out completely. If I look over in the effect editor, I see that right now it's taking the color from the image. I want to actually colorize it and use a color preset. I'm thinking something yellowish. I'm diving into the presets here. There's a bunch of preset colors, but I think yellow is going to work best here, just to give it a really subtle kind of gold effect to it. I am going to shorten this a little bit because I think that's going to be a little bit too long. I'm going to do a lot of scrubbing through effects just because of bandwidth. If I play this, usually I would actually play through the effect to preview it, but probably because of bandwidth, you're not going to see that real time, so I'll scrub to make sure that you can see that. And that is what I'm looking for. I think that's going to be just perfect. The last thing I'm going to want to do with the on-screen controls is just move the light source over to the hoop, and then I think that is going to be exactly what I want. Now, this particular sequence is a repetition of that action, and so I think a repetition of this transition is going to be good. There's of course, I could just take the transition and drag it over to each edit, but there are some quicker ways of accessing our transitions that I'm going to want to cover here. One of them, of course, which we've been using for years, is you might have a favorite bin of effect, and if you're not doing this, I highly suggest you do. I can drag the BCC Raise Dissolve over into my my favorite effects. Make sure that favorite effects is open, and then from here, and I actually like to literally physically have my favorite effects right next to the timeline so that I don't have as far to drag. The shorter dragging means, I mean, it adds up to time in your day. I want to shorten the amount of time that my mouse is on the screen. And so I could apply the transition this way, and that's great. And you notice when I do apply it, it's got all of everything is exactly as I set it up. If I had keyframes, the keyframes are exactly how they were. I didn't have any keyframes here, but you see that the length is the same. Actually, one of the things I'll usually do when I apply, when I save a favorite like this, is I'll actually put the number of frames in, because sometimes you might have a 10-frame version, a 20-frame version, and so it's a great way of saving your most often used transitions. You might have separate bins, say for instance for flares and for wipes and that kind of thing, and that's really, really handy. But another way of working that might not be as intuitive is I like to use quick transitions, and when you first apply the quick transition, you'll notice that it gives a lot of control over the edit. You can choose whether it's centered on the cut, whether it's ending at the cut, whether it's starting at the cut. You can change the duration. You can also choose which tracks to apply it to. And so I use these for quick dissolves and crossfades all the time. But it may not be immediately obvious that if you actually create a bin called quick transitions, any transitions that are in that bin can now be triggered by your quick dissolve button. And so if I go inside the quick transitions, now I find this BCC Raise Dissolve. Now this BCC Raise Dissolve, I also have control over whether it's centered on the cut, whether it's 20 frames, maybe I only want it 15 frames this time. Maybe I want one over here that ends at the cut. And so I really, really like using quick transitions for some of my most used effects, because it does give me this control every single time I use the effect on exactly how I'm going to place that effect. Now, of course, I have to go back in to each of these and make sure that that they're centered on the hoop. This one is pretty close. I'm going to this one and drag that up there, and go into this last one and make sure that, oops, I actually did apply a dissolve on that one. Let's kill that dissolve and apply what I really wanted, which was my BCC Raise Dissolve. And now go into the effect editor and make sure that the light source is on that hoop. Now, you're not going to get full speed on this, but as I play through, that is what I'm looking for. I'll scrub just so that you can get that view. And so quick transitions, really, really quick way of working. Now, one last way, which I don't actually have on this particular system because I'm using Avid 7.04. This is on a 2011 iMac, and one of the things I love about these transitions is they're all green dot effects, even on this 4-year-old machine. But in Avid 8.2, it introduces an even faster way of working with favorite effects, and that's that you can actually have a global folder that you can access on all of your projects on your machine. One of the things that you may notice with your favorite effect bins, and you've probably had to do this before, is that once I have a bunch of these favorites built in my project, if I open up another project, they're not immediately available. If I open up another project, I have to navigate. I have to go open bin and then find them on my hard drive and make sure that they're open in this particular project. Well, with Avid 8.2, what I can do to my favorites bins is I can just right-click inside the bin, and then I'll have an option to save it to my favorite effects. And then any project that I open will have a folder at the top or the bottom as I select it that has all of my favorite effect bins automatically located and handy to the project. So that's also a really quick way to work. So enough about the time-saving techniques. Let's have some fun looking at some of the effects that come with BCC 9. Swish pans are some of the most often used effects, and if you're like me, we used to use them in older versions of Avid, and especially if you don't have BCC, by actually doing a push on one layer and then you keyframe a blur on the layer above it. Well, it's nice to have it all in one place, and we do use these a lot. And so let's open this up, see what's going on. Of course, there's a push that's happening underneath, and then there's a blur that's ramping up and down to sort of hide that push. And swish pans usually work best when they're short. This is a full second. I don't think I want necessarily a full second. You might want 8 or 10 frames. I'm going to use 20 and actually play with the eases on this. I like to have more of the S shape to my transitions, and so that it eases really slowly at the beginning and then it accelerates really quickly into that blur and then out. And you'll notice with the swish pan that once you start playing with this, that if you ease in the way that I'm doing it, you can have a little bit of a border between the two shots. And there's a quick way of fixing that. If you go open up the blur extras, just drag the blur delay slightly to the left. And what that does is it delays the push until the blur has ramped up a bit, and then the push starts. And so it hides that border and makes it really, really seamless. So that is the swish pan. There's lots more that you could tweak inside there. You could increase the blur if you wanted to, but that's looking pretty good to me. Let's jump over to the next one and look at the vignette wipe. Now BCC 9 has a great new vignette effect with lots more control. And when you first apply the vignette wipe, you might think it's just sort of a feathered circular wipe, but there's a lot more going on than what immediately meets the eye. And so I'm going to come sort of halfway through. I'm going to turn off the softness so that I can show you some of the options that are available. If I go into the patterns, I have a whole bunch of different patterns to the edge that I can apply. And so we see that there's sine waves, there's opposing noise, there's a bunch of really random things. But say if I choose this sine, I can dig into the pattern settings, and I can choose sort of how long these spikes are. I can choose the detail level, in other words, how many of the spikes there are. And so we can see that what used to be a vignette wipe is now a very different looking wipe, which depending on what you're doing might be the perfect thing for what you're looking for. And also, depending on the project, I worked on a lot of comic book documentary shows, and there's some neat borders that you can access. 3 borders actually that you can color independently, and for the right project provide a really neat look. Let me just come into the effect a little bit so you can see what's going on there. Really, really neat look for the right project, not necessarily for this one, but that is the vignette wipe. And let's jump ahead to damaged TV. Is something that we've used for years, but is always a really render-intensive effect. And what I love with the damaged TV dissolve in BCC 9 is it's a green dot effect, and which is pretty amazing when you think of, oops, let me make sure to apply it to the clip here, which is really nice when you consider how many things are going on. I mean, you've got noise that's being added, you've got scan lines that are being added, you've got some warping that's going on the image, you've got a roll bar that's transitioning between the 2 clips. Quite a bit going on. One of the things I should point out is that the effect browser is a great way of navigating all of the presets. With the damaged TV, there's quite a few, and you're not going to see live playback here, but you can actually play them and immediately see exactly which damaged TV version you're going to want to choose. I think that, again, thinking organic, there's all these water droplets in the background. I'm going to want something with a fair amount of static in it. And I do still want that roll bar, just because a damaged TV needs a roll bar, I think. Let's apply this one and see if it's going to do the trick. And another thing that might not be immediately evident is that in the damaged TV transition, the dissolve duration is actually the duration of the roll bar. So if you extend this out further, it makes the roll bar slower. If you tighten this dissolve duration, it makes that roll bar move more quickly through the frame. But that is looking, yeah, that's about how I want that one. Let's jump ahead now. Here you see, and this is again Weymouth Design, some beautiful footage of downtown Boston. You see that there's a wide shot, and then all of a sudden this bike appears. What I'd like to do here is I want to sort of make it look like the camera goes out of focus, and then when it focuses back in, here's the bike. And so I'm going to use the BCC lens transition, and this is not just applying a Gaussian blur. This is doing a lot more, and it's a really, really cool transition. If you know anything about lenses, different lenses provide different bokeh, and where that comes from is it comes from the iris of the lens. I'm going to turn on the iris so you can see what I'm talking about. This BCC lens transition actually simulates different kinds of irises of lenses. And so what it does is it provides an extremely physically accurate reproduction of a lens. And if you wanted to get really crazy, you can actually simulate a very specific lens and make this transition exactly like a certain lens. Let's open in the effects browser just to illustrate even a bit more. So if you look at some of the highlights, you see how the highlights are sort of circular, and that's from this bokeh effect that that comes in, and also sometimes the color gets a little blown out. That's all related to the physics of the lens. And so let's just have a look and see. I definitely want it to be a lot more blurry than that. So let's increase here and scale up the iris a bit, and definitely going to need that a lot shorter, and going to play with the ease as well. For this to work, it has to be the right length. So let's say 15 frames and scrub through. Yeah, he kind of appears out of the bokeh, which is a really, really cool, neat effect. And actually, organically, this might be going a little far, but the circular wheels play in with the circular bokeh and ties everything together. I like that. Now to get out of the sequence, we've got this breakdancing footage, really beautiful footage. I don't suggest you try this at home, doing backflips in slippery water and pavement. It seems like a bad combination, but he's doing it pretty well. And so I want to organically look at this image. It's got a lot of vertical lines, and I think rather than just a fade out or a dip to color, I think that a vertical blur is going to look good. So I'm going to go to the BCC blur dissolve and play with that a little bit. I'm going to want to navigate to a vertical preset that just immediately gives me a vertical blur, and then play with the color a little bit. I'd like it to be more sort of high contrast. I'm keying off that damaged TV that was earlier. I'd like this to be kind of like an old school TV turning off is sort of what I'm going for here, which means it's going to have to be even shorter than that. And let's maybe bring this contrast peak down a little bit, and let's see how that looks. Sort of, yeah, that is what I'm going for. Just like the TV's turning off. If you want to get really picky, I think it could even be shorter. But those are just a few of the fun transitions. There's a lot more that you can play around with, but I think one really, really helpful thing is to look at adding more to a single transition to enhance it. And so there's different ways that you can add more to these transitions. And one thing that is not necessarily adding another visual effect, but adding a sound effect. Sound effects go really well with transitions. And it's important, just like I mentioned before, that you don't just throw any old sound effect on. I think it's important to think organically about the content and what is the best sound effect that would be motivated by that content. So a swish pan underneath has a push. You're pushing this whole image out of the way and pushing in another one. That's if you imagine actually pushing one out of the other, you'd imagine that there would be sort of a low whoosh involved. And so I'm going to want a whoosh under that push. Let me just apply this low whoosh under this one. And so one of the things that we do in television is we sort of have different themes of the sound effects. And so if I find a good whoosh that goes with a swish pan, I'm going to make sure that every time the swish pan is used that you hear this whoosh. I'm not sure how well you're going to hear this sound. I'm going to crank it up a little bit. If you hear that whoosh, it gives a cue to our auditory senses that makes that swish pan actually seem more impacting. And so you'll find that your transitions actually look better when they sound better. For something like a damaged TV, I might have sort of a sizzly effect. Yeah, I mean, you could go with an actual changing channels. That might be a little too on the nose, but thinking of the static sort of implies a sizzle. And so you can have fun with picking different sound effects to go with different transitions and create sort of a theme to your video. You'll find it goes a long way in enhancing these edits. Sound isn't the only way that you can enhance the edits, of course. One of the things you can do is you can layer effects. So say, for instance, I have this this footage of this woman blowing these this sort of confetti, this star type confetti, and then she goes into a dream state. Just going to kill this transition here and rebuild it. She goes into a dream state, and in everybody's dream state, there's in slow motion on a motorcycle, of course, and then we have the stars at the end. Really beautiful slow motion footage. And so to get into that dream state, I think that flares, lens flares, those kinds of things are really great for dreaminess. I'm going to close this here, and let's apply the BCC lens flare dissolve and size that to fit. And immediately, one of the things that that I like to do with a lens flare is draw the eye where I want it to go. And you'll notice in the incoming shot, she's on the motorbike facing to the right, and she's also to the right of center, which is a little bit of an unsettling visual, what do you call that, composition. And so I want to sort of lessen that unsettling effect by drawing the eye towards where she is. And so I'm going to take the end position of this lens flare and put it where she is. I'm going to take the start position. I know that my outgoing shot is sort of in the center. And now when I play through this transition, we see it starts sort of between her eyes and just subtly draws our eye towards the right. So that helps draw our eye toward the incoming shot in a way that is going to be less jarring. This looks good, but it's not entirely what I want to do. What I'd like to do is key off of this confetti. And how can I key off the confetti? I'm thinking a particle system is going to work really well. This is not a transition, it's an effect. Let's go into the BCC particles category and maybe grab a BCC particle emitter 3D. Now, particle systems are really, really powerful. You might be intimidated by them. Don't be. You really should practice with them because there's a lot of power in particle systems. And once you understand what they're doing, you can have a lot of control over them. For now, let's open up the effects browser. This is another thing that I think really, really benefits from being able to see your presets visually. And let's sort of park a little further in and dial through some amazing stuff. You can literally simulate smoke. You can have a white cloud fly through. Just a tip: this is great for lower thirds. For a quick lower third, just color that and put your text on top. And you can, I mean, lots of flame and different cool stuff. For right now, I'm thinking this swarming sphere is sort of what I'm going for. What I'd like is for it to start at nothing and kind of almost like the confetti is lighting on fire as it comes toward you. This preset actually works really, really well for what I'm looking for. Let's apply that. Now you'll see immediately after I've applied it that it looks good, but I do need to tweak a little bit. When that lens flare comes, I want it to look like it's sort of the confetti sort of lighting the image on fire, and it looks like it's already kind of embers at that point. So I'm going to go into the particle settings of the particle emitter and change the colors. Right now we see that there's a lot of dark colors in here. I want to make everything sort of lighter, like a light yellowish, to be really, really close to the color of that that BCC lens flare. Little variations to add interest, but not so dark. And already that's looking a lot more what I am looking for. So that by the time that lens flare is full up, we barely see the particles. And then the other thing that's happening is they're sort of growing too quickly, and it's not the organic look that I'm looking for. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the emitter. The emitter is where the particles emit from, and change a few of these settings. I'm going to have a much slower birth rate and maybe higher speed so that they don't, that's maybe a little bit too much, so they don't birth as quickly, but when they do birth, they sort of come quickly out at the eye. And what I might do is actually play with the scale a little bit to make sure that they're sort of a little more evenly distributed throughout the screen, and I also go into the particles and increase the size of the particles as well, because I want them to kind of seem like embers by the point they're fully up. And so that is. And now, because I've done that, I'm going to have to dial back on the speed and birth rate, because now that they're bigger, they're filling too much of the screen. So you can play with this more, and I want for them to be sort of full up just at the point that this reaches here. So I'm going to dial the birth rate back even more, and dial the speed back even more. And that is getting a lot closer to what I'm looking for. You can, I mean, we're just doing this in a minute or two. You could tweak this to your heart's content, but that is looking pretty good. I'm going to have to add a quick dissolve at the end of it to V2. Let's give it maybe a 6-frame dissolve at the end, so that as I step through, as the lens flare is dying out, so are the embers, and we're left with our image here. So much, much more organic than that simple lens flare, and I've done that by adding an effect on V2. Let's have a look at another way that we can use an effect to enhance a transition. Over here, when I first played through the sequence, I had to play a couple of times before I noticed that there are these stars, this confetti that's being kicked up by this motorbike. I mean, pretty clever, but pretty subtle. I really, really want to enhance that. I also notice if you look at the image, it is kind of a dreamy sequence, and you've got this blurred out sort of background, and so I don't want to key off that. I'm going to apply a BCC fast film glow dissolve to the transition, and sort of key off that dreaminess. And that's great for the transition itself, but I want to draw the eye toward those that confetti on the bottom of the screen. So let's go into our BCC film style category. I could apply the fast film glow, which is a great effect, but the fast film glow doesn't have a pixel chooser. So I want to apply the BCC film glow effect. And what this lets me do is I can navigate to the pixel chooser down at the bottom, turn that on, and let's dig inside. And for the pixel chooser settings, I want to choose a shape that's maybe an inside oval, and have that inside oval centered where that confetti is coming. And I'm going to want to pull up on the region blend, which basically feathers the edge of that mask, and then from here, I can pull up on the intensity so you see what's going on. And I probably want to color that sort of a little bluish maybe. You could go into the effects browser. There's a number of different color settings you can use, but for me, I think that is going to work. Now, all of a sudden, you see those blue stars much better. What I am going to want to do is keyframe it so that at the beginning we don't see any of that. So I'm going to put a keyframe on the glow intensity and pull it right back down to 0. And then when I want it to be full up is sort of when the cloud is full up. So add a keyframe here and bring it up to around 200-ish. And the other thing that this is going to do is it organically introduces that film glow to our eye before the film glow transition. Actually, I might go back to this fast film glow dissolve and also color this a little blue so they really tie together. It's a very subtle effect, but your eye is much more drawn toward the bottom of the screen now because of that really subtle pixel chooser applying of this BCC film glow to the bottom of the screen. So very subtle, but it has definitely enhanced this transition. Now, sometimes you don't need a transition at all. Sometimes you can use an effect as a transition. I'm going to just open up a sequence. We're back in the basketball, and you see that at the end there's one that I didn't apply to. Just for speed, I'm going to apply a pre-prepared effect here, which is a BCC extruded spline, and I'll just show you what's happening. On the BCC extruded spline, you can create this cool sort of 3D effect where you can choose, you can affect the corner size of this. You can scale it up and down, and then once you do that, you have all kinds of control over the lights, over the depth, over the 3D orientation of it, the bevel, etc. And it can create a really neat effect. Then all you have to do is put the outgoing shot on one side, the incoming shot on the other, and just with a few keyframes, you've created a really neat custom transition. Now you notice once it goes further into Z space, we've got just a plain black background. So I'm going to want to add something like a BCC particle emitter. And you remember that one I was talking about, the preset with the smoke just creates a perfect little background there. I've already pre-colored that to yellow to go with the yellowish BCC rays dissolve that I had applied earlier. And that is a really neat transition, something you might see on a sports channel, honestly. That's done without a transition. I mean, this is a custom effect that now acts as a transition, and so you could save that to one of your favorite bins and use that all the time. You can tweak it for different kinds of looks, but some really powerful stuff. Now, another sort of different way of looking completely is with the beat reactor. When you think conceptually about what's happening with the transition. With a transition, you are trying to unify different unrelated clips. So I've a clip of this boy being spun around, and then I have a completely unrelated clip visually, a different boy playing in the water, and then this break dancer. And so a transition is basically finding a way to bridge one clip to the other, to tie these clips together in a way that bonds them. And so I don't necessarily have to do that with a transition at the edge between these two clips. What I can do is use something like a beat reactor. What the beat reactor does, if I zoom in, you can see the waveform of the sound has sort of peaks and valleys, And what the beat reactor does is, for pretty much any effect, you can choose to have it trigger parameters of the effect based on the waveforms of the music, which is a really, really powerful way to work that involves no keyframes. I mean, think you could just apply a whole bunch of keyframes based on where you see these points. How much easier is it for to let Boris do it for you? Let's actually see it in action. Apply maybe a BCC color correction, very simple effect. And now let's open up the settings for this effect and choose the beat reactor. When we first choose the beat reactor, we have to navigate on disk to an external file. What I've done here is I've got exports of different parts of the sequence that I can just bring back in to use for the beat reactor. One of the reasons that you might not want to do this is, say for instance, if you have stock music, they often come with different orchestration. So you might have an underscore that's just bass and drums. Depending on the effect that you're using, that might actually be a better beat reactor clip than the full orchestration. And so you can play with different versions for different effects, different layers. When you first bring it up, it shows a visual representation of what's going on. This can actually be really helpful when you're doing your edit, because you can shift the edits that are underneath to go along with where you see where Boris reads that waveform. And so this is telling you where the peaks are going to be in that sound file. And as of course we don't see anything happening right now, and that's because we haven't told the beat reactor which parameter to apply to. So say for instance the BCC color correction here, I'm going to go over to the beat reactor settings and apply to parameter of brightness. And of course it's a little too much when I first apply it. Let's dial back on the max output, which is basically actually first what I'm going to show is that you can choose what part of the parameter, whether you add to the value of the parameter. So say for instance the brightness was already 100, it would add the waveform value to that 100. That probably isn't what we want here. We want to replace the value of the brightness. And so it basically replaces the value of the brightness with what it reads from the waveform. And you can also affect the strength of how you apply that. So that will say, for instance, double the, if you to set this up to 200, it'll double the effect of that waveform on that effect. So now as I scrub through this, leaving those waveforms up, you can see that every time you see the waveform spike, you see the brightness spike. If I turn off that waveform, open up the beat reactor, and turn off the graph, we can see just the effect of the color correction on the footage. It's going to be hard to see here in the webinar because of the frame rate, because of the bandwidth. But what's happening is every time there's a spike in the music, there's a spike in the brightness. We can enhance that a little bit more. Let's apply a BCC prism. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows so that I can layer this on rather than replacing the brightness. So I'm going to layer this on top of this, and of course now I have to go inside the BCC prism and make sure that I choose the same external file. And now you see what the BCC prism is doing. Look on the left side of this image. It's sort of making a chromatic aberration happen that also goes along with the same waveform elements, the same music beats. And so as I play through this, without adding a transition, it gives a really interesting way of unifying these clips together, which is exactly what we're trying to do with transitions. Let's have a quick look at another variation. I'm going to apply another pre-prepared clip here or effect here, and then apply a Gaussian blur. Again, holding down the Option key on Mac, Alt on Windows, so that I layer these two together, and going to navigate to all. Oh, something I forgot to mention earlier. When you are looking at these effects, It can be really, really helpful to view a certain subset of your parameters. When I first opened the effect, you saw that it was only the edited parameters, and so I only saw a subset of the options available. This can actually be really, really handy when you're saving effects, because when you go inside the effect, there's a ton of different parameters to manipulate, and when you go back into the effect, you want to be able to jump quickly to the settings that you've already set to make your tweaks and changes. And so if you change this to from all to only edited, it's only going to show me the parameters that have been touched before. Really, really helpful. The equivalent in After Effects is hitting UU on a layer, or you can actually choose to go only to the keyframes, View Params Animated, and that'll just show me what has been keyframed in this effect. Really, really helpful. And so when I'm going into these edited controls, actually choose all at the moment so that I can choose the external file. Summer Fountains 2 is this part of the sequence, and so we see now the blur is going along with the music, which is a really, really cool effect. One of the things I'll note with the Gaussian blur, that you may want to actually keyframe this, even with shelf keyframes, to get a really, really stark effect. Going along with the music doesn't necessarily give it a sharp enough effect, so you can enhance it with keyframes. I'll show you what's going on here. Keyframing the mix with original. So really spike, really heighten the blur really high, and then just use keyframes to mix with the original on the transition points, on the points that you want the greatest effect. I'm going to play that. You might not see it in full frames, but really, really neat looking stuff. I'll scrub back through, and you can see, without having any actual transitions on this footage, we've unified these clips together in a really organic and exciting way. So those are just a few of the ways that you can play with BCC 9's powerful transitions and effects. I should be mentioning that one of the things we're going to be doing with these webinars is posting some of these custom transitions and effects so that you can use them in your own projects. Watch for those on the website, and so that'll hopefully be handy to you. And actually, I believe that Boris is going to be providing even some of the ones from older webinars as well. So really, really exciting stuff. That's about all the time we have, and now it's time for questions and prizes.